Hello, Internet. Dr. D here. Today's topic is what is torture? Regrettably, this is not an historical question about the medieval period. Torture is still being used by governments today in many countries around the world. What we're referring to in this video is not torture that is carried out by one private individual against another, although that is also illegal. In this video, we're discussing torture carried out by agents of the state for one reason or another. Also, by the way, there are no images of torture in this video. There are several important international legal instruments which define and outlaw torture, but the most important is the Convention Against Torture, ratified at the United Nations in 1987. According to this, torture means any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is suspected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, or for any reason based on discrimination of any kind, when such pain or suffering is inflicted by or at the instigation of or with the consent or acquiescence of a public official or other person acting in an official capacity. It does not include pain or suffering arising only from, inherent in, or incidental to lawful sanctions. That last line seems to indicate that torture is considered acceptable if it is an official part of a nation's penal system. But the European Court of Human Rights, for one, considers state-sanctioned torture to be illegal in all cases, no exceptions allowed. This is important because an autocratic government, which makes all the laws simply to suit itself, could easily declare torture to be a legitimate part of its legal system. In 1973, Amnesty International published a very simple, clear-cut definition of torture. Torture is the systematic and deliberate infliction of acute pain by one person on another or on a third person in order to accomplish the purpose of the former against the will of the latter. Note that making threats of torture is as illegal as torture itself. Also, torture includes inflicting mental anguish as well as physical pain. This may be done through sexual humiliation or solitary confinement, for example. As you're probably aware, torture has been used in many different cultures around the world at one time or another. Thankfully, it is much rarer today than it once was, but it still exists, and one case of torture is one too many. But that still leaves us with the question, why would you want to torture somebody? The first and oldest purpose of torture is punishment and or revenge. Depending on the type of government deploying torture, these two reasons may be one and the same. For one thing, most pre-modern cultures did not have extensive prison systems, and so practiced torture and forced labor as forms of punishment. Public torture was used to terrorize the people into obedience. Also, almost all pre-modern governments were autocratic, so breaking the law was considered a personal affront to the king or emperor. That meant that the punishment was personal as well, and is another reason why horrible tortures were used. You hadn't just broken the law, you had insulted the king. That might clarify why places like Saudi Arabia and North Korea still have the punishments that they do. The second reason for torture, and probably the most common one in the modern era, is terrorism and extortion. This is typically used against prisoners of conscience, people who are guilty of nothing more than practicing their freedom of speech. Such people can cause great trouble for autocratic or corrupt governments, especially when they are activists or journalists. One way to silence critics is to torture them into silence. The tactics vary. The government might release the prisoner after torturing them to send a message to other critics of what might happen to them. More sophisticated operators might use tortures which leave no marks on the victim, or use strictly psychological torture like solitary confinement or threats against the prisoner's family. The government can then claim that there never was any torture. Another common use of torture is extortion. Police can torture prisoners into signing false confessions or can demand money from the victim's family to stop the torture. In either case, the prisoner is rarely guilty of the crime of which they are accused. The point is irrelevant to the torturers. It's done to make money from a bribe or to let the real criminals off the hook. And forced confessions are illegal under international law for obvious reasons. The third reason for torture, and perhaps the most controversial, is to obtain information from the victim. This is sometimes done to terrorism suspects to get actionable intelligence. You may remember the great controversy in the United States about the ethics of waterboarding and other tortures at Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. The general consensus among experts is that torture is not an effective way to get information. The reason is obvious. The victim will say anything to stop the torture. They will typically say whatever they think the torturer wants to hear. This is why the U.S. Army Field Manual, in explaining techniques for interrogating prisoners of war, says use of torture and other illegal methods is a poor technique that yields unreliable results, may damage subsequent collection efforts, and can induce the source to say what he thinks the interrogator wants to hear. Torture is degrading of human dignity. It is a basic disrespect of our human rights. As Amnesty International puts it, the use of torture destroys people, corrodes the rule of law, undermines the criminal justice system, and erodes public trust in public institutions and the state they represent. It causes severe pain and suffering to victims, which continues long after the acts of torture stop. It is also useless as a means of interrogation, so there is never an excuse to torture anyone. Amnesty International estimates that today torture is still being used in 141 countries around the world. Torture badly damages those societies. It breeds a deep fear and distrust of authorities, and it prevents those societies from developing a true system of justice. As long as torture exists anywhere in the world, nobody is entirely safe. I'll put some links in the description box below regarding torture as it's still practiced today so that you can do your own research.